Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome back. Grandpa Stigler reporting in for duty. Um, Hi, welcome back. It's nice to see all of you, and by see all of you, I mean talk to no one but my computer and understand that all of your lovely intellects are going to be hearing this and thinking to yourself, um, I don't know what you're going to be thinking to yourself. That's up to you to decide. Anyway, I just wanted to, as I said in my email, basically amend the flub, the technological flub that occurred that has removed the lecture on cultural confinement, as we're going to talk about today, for some reason. And so I'm going to post this today, and then in the next day, I'll be posting the next lecture. What I've realized with the technology thing is that you can't really overwhelm technology, but you need to hug it, care for it like a little egg, and then carefully take it to where it needs to be. So hang tight. Okay, so I thought that it was a little serendipitous that two of the artists that are mentioned in Boris Groys's Art Power were two exhibitions that we did not see as a group, but that were on view in New York City while we were there. And so on that, whoops, that's like the one way that I really could have tweaked this to better serve this syllabus, or to tweak our New York trip to better serve the syllabus. But it's important for you to understand that the trip to New York was much bigger than just the confines of this syllabus, in the same way that, as Robert Smithson states in Cultural Confinement, the museum only creates a barrier system that artists need to get outside of. And so the syllabus creates a barrier system that New York City gets us outside of. But that said, I do want to talk a little bit about the work of Marcel Brothers, as well as the collaborative effort of Fischli and Weiss. And as I said, as I promised, I will be keeping this lecture fairly short today, because I understand you guys have had a kind of a crazy week getting bouncing papers and notes back and forth to one another. And so really I'll just hit the ground running. So I'm not going to show you any slides by Robert Smithson. Dude had a good career. Dude was prolific. Dude also made a lot of environmental decisions that I think are erroneous, cocky, bullheaded. There's lots of different words we can throw around here. And there are a couple of gestures that he made during the tail end of his life that could have actually rectified this position in my head of him being a horrible person for the globe, but those are not regarded as art. And if you have questions about what those are, well, I'll just have to talk about them to you in person, because I don't have pictures of the island that he bought to turn into an earthwork that never was turned into an earthwork, because the island presented itself as a complete enough thing that it didn't need to become altered and therefore become an earthwork. Had he done that across the board, he probably wouldn't have been recognized as an artist, but he would have, for my sweet little environmentalist heart, warmed my sweet little environmentalist heart. I should have said that in another way around, but such is life. The one thing that I was hoping to elicit in a conversation between Robert Smithson and Boris Groys is to show you how much this theoretical discourse has actually advanced, and how we have moved from a position where artists actually did need to fight for their rights to party, and fight for their rights to speak as they want to speak outside of the purview of a curatorial agenda, the purview of a museological agenda, the purview of a board of directors that usually imparts a museological agenda that subsequently imparts a curatorial agenda. Get it? There's this chain that establishes power, that establishes lines of inquiry, that is, well, basically, to the saddest extent, can be seen from the outside as being run by money, by cold hard cash. That's not exactly the case. And while it's very, very important that you get that as a foundation moving forward, that money does actually make a certain portion of the world go around, there are, in fact, ways of seeing the museum as an institution and this notion of cultural confinement in different lights. And those different lights will potentially give us the ability to reap some benefits from these conversations. And so Robert Smithson is my curmudgeon. Oh, I am going to find a picture of a curmudgeon. Hang on. Okay. Our curmudgeon. This is Robert Smithson. And Robert Smithson, like a lot of other people in his generation, had a position that the rule system of the museum was so restrictive that it eliminated the potential for artists to really expand their practices. And he, like a lot of other artists, not just male artists, but like a lot of other artists, predominantly male artists, he wanted to get outside of the cultural confines that were A, the institution of a museum, B, the institution of a city like New York City, and C, the institution of an art world. Smithson, like Judd, like Nancy Holt, like Michael Heiser, like I can only think of Rodin Crater, which is not the name of the artist. And so I'm sorry, my brain is not coming up with that guy who had the really witty retort to Drake using his images in, or using the installation shots. His name will come to me, and I'm sorry that it's not. But anyway, there's all these people, and we as art historians, and you as artists with hindsight, call these people the earth artists. These are artists that wanted to get outside of James Turrell. Got it. So James Turrell, Nancy Holt, Michael Heiser, Smithson, Judd, they all wanted to get away from all of these confines because they felt that their ideas were being too restricted. Now, some of you, while in this program, have been told that you cannot produce certain works because of the confines of the institution that you are currently embroiled within. Embroiled is kind of a tense word, and I use it on purpose. That your relationship to the main College of Art disallows you the ability to make certain works that you might want to produce. This creates a certain level of frustration, I imagine, on your part. It's a frustration that I feel as well as the teacher who wants to see you expand your horizons and engage in a way that is not confined. Specifically because this is a program that's about communication, and how can you communicate if we're telling you not to communicate in certain ways? Blah, blah, blah. You've all heard me say this, at least I hope you have, because I try to say it as often as I possibly can. So anyway, theoretically, I'm kind of with these guys. I'm with these folks that want to say the institution of art is too rigid and we need to get outside of it. And so in his very nicely, very polemically worded piece of writing, Robert Smithson essentially says that the curators are killing us, the museums are killing us, art needs to be more free, and in that more free, in that increased freedom, we have to get out of these confines. That is the kind of thinking that yields Marfa, Texas, that yields Lightning Field, Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels, Rodin Crater by James Turrell, so on and so forth. Robert Smithson did a series of works outside that are regarded as earthworks. You're familiar probably with Spiral Jetty, but he also did some other ones as well. This is what they do. And this is the face that they make while looking at curators that tell them you cannot install a lightning field in, I don't even know where they would install it in Brooklyn, but probably somewhere down near the water. And so James Turrell would make a face like Grumpy Cat. Like, I don't, no, no, I'm just going to go and find some other place. And so these artists develop strategies to expand their horizons within the purview of art, but outside of the confinement that they felt from the cultural institutions. Now, what happens as a retaliation against that, and actually kind of before that, but really it didn't get a lot of attention in this country until after that, was the development of the work done by Marcel Brothers. Brothers, who I understand is the subject of one of your research papers, and so one of you has a lot of information on Brothers, and the other has just completed a rough reading and commenting on a rough draft on a paper on Marcel Brothers. And so for the sake of conversation, I'm going to kind of whiz through this guy and talk a little bit more about Fischli and Weiss. Brothers, in the same vein as someone like Robert Smithson, saw that the role of the artist had been confined. There were shackles placed on them that eliminated their ability to speak adequately, to have the kinds of conversations that they want to have. But instead of saying, I disagree with you, I'm going to leave, what Brothers was engaged with was something I think a little bit more divisive. I think it was also a little bit more patient and a little bit more cutting. Because essentially what Brothers did was he said, I'm going to begin an analysis of this cultural confinement that allows me the ability to speak, that allows me the ability to expand upon this discourse, and that allows me the ability to continue to engage with the city, the art world, the community that I appreciate, but in a way that is fitting for me and voices the kinds of criticisms and critiques that I want to voice. And so here we have Penn's Beat, which is a kind of the foundational work for Marcel. I'm going to refer to him as Marcel. And essentially, Brothers, as I know Adrian was talking about this at one point, but Brothers was a poet. And at a certain point, he realized that his poetry career was not going the way that he wanted to. And so he took a lot of these unsold copies of his book and he collected them, covered them in plaster, encased them in plaster, and created a sculptural camp, as it were, where these volumes were to be living, essentially. And over time, the materials that he encased these poems in began to deteriorate, rendering the image that you see before you, or the sculpture, the image of the sculpture that you see before you. And so this combination of things was a way for Brothers to essentially encase a problem. His problem being, I'm a poet that no one wants to read. So I'm going to encase this problem as a way of getting the full gestalt, as it were, the whole thing, seeing the full forest for every single tree that is there. And he makes it, by doing that, makes it kind of difficult to access. In this case, he makes it impossible to access. I'm going to put up a wall that you can't enter, and that wall is going to define this institution or the confine that I put myself in. Backtrack a little bit. Brothers begins with this work to identify that as culture develops, culture creates a casing around itself. It creates walls around itself that serve to not only encase it from safety potentially, but also give it the ability to become self-reflexive. It was only after encasing all of these volumes of Penn's Beat, did Brothers and us as historians really come to understand what he thought about his poems, what he thought about being a poet, and we could actually begin to more readily unpack his disposition as someone who is in the process of critiquing institutions. Now, then we get to things like this. It's a pot of mussels. Yes, it's a pot of mussels. This pot of mussels is a sculpture created by Brothers that is part of a body of work where he uses mussel shells as well as egg shells to talk about this very notion of a system which in its development creates out of itself the confines that it exists within. Now, we've talked a little bit about last summer the idea of autopoiesis, which is a word that I constantly get wrong, but it is, I'm having like a bibliographic train wreck in my head. I'm trying to come up with the name of the author for whom the text I do not have in front of me because I'm between my home. I'm obviously in my home office. That's all my stuff. And this book is the Contemporary Art, 1989 to the present book. And so it's the conversation about the autopoietic form. Essentially, autopoietic forms are forms that are self-generating. They're forms that create the shape because they are in the process of that development. They are growing, and therefore they create this encasement. Where they create it's kind of like a structure that is before human knowledge, or a structure that is, in other words, a priori. The mussel shell, as well as the egg shell, at least for the metaphor that I'm running with. There are other metaphors and there are other explanations for these ideas that are equally as awesome, that are equally as engaging, that probably show up in that paper that I was talking about a second ago. But I'm talking about it with regard to edge and with regard to a kind of internal development of an external edge. Mussels grow shells. They grow shells in the process of their development. That means that every mussel shell is the evidence of a process whereby something created not just itself, but created an exterior and an interior of self. And that exterior actually became disassociated slightly from the living thing, right? The shell does not make the living creature. The shell supports the living creature in the living creature's life cycle, but the shell is actually a dead thing. It's part of it. It's the residue, as it were. And in thinking about museums and the relationship to this notion of residue or autopoiesis, it's important to understand, or what I'm getting at here, and I'm borrowing a lot of this from our friend Boris Groys, who the latter half of the text I'm going to deal with when in the next lecture, which is going to be much more a survey of kind of what happened in New York City, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so museums, culture, language, these are all things that are self-developing. You might think to yourself, well, a museum isn't self-developing. And while I might agree with you to a certain point, I gotta say, as the director of the Institute for American Art, there are a lot of things that I did to begin this project, but there are a lot of things that I did not have any control of as this project developed. And it's important for you to understand that, especially when museums get to a point where they become collaborative, where you have more than one person, more than one voice, more than one agent, the outer crust of that shell actually becomes a little bit more resistant. It becomes a little bit more codified. You have more people inside the shell that are adding ideas to what's on that outside. You know, this kind of a thing. Like, I'm going to put my content in your face and make it more difficult for you to access what is actually going on inside. So, metaphorically speaking, these mussel shells and the other eggshell projects that Brothers works towards are the precursor or the predecessor to a project that is referred to as the Department of Eagles. It's actually the Museum of Modern Art section of, or the Museum of Modern Art Department of Eagles. So what Brothers begins to do with the development of this project, there are other projects that I'm going to talk about in just a second that continue his critique of institutions as autopoietic form. But we have here this idea that Brothers collects a variety of things, and I have shown you these works before. I really like these things quite a lot. But essentially, excuse me, what Brothers does is he identifies that we as a culture have been making things in the shape of eagles for a long time. And what he is interested in doing or saying with this, or what he's interested in running with regard to this eagle motif was, I'm going to collect all of the eagles and I'm going to put them in a thing. And by collecting all of those eagles and by putting them in a thing, like a vitrine or a room or a gallery, what he does is he inadvertently creates a collection that has a relationship. That collection then establishes by its relationship its own edge. We walk into the space and we are not shaped as eagles. And so we have a kind of conversation whereby this collection of eagles, this grouping of things, presents to us our sense of otherness. I am not an eagle, therefore I do not fit within this categorical milieu. Now, what would happen if you walked in and you were, say, wearing a necklace that had an eagle on it, or a ring that had an eagle on it? Well, your otherness to this institution, the access points that you have to this institution or this collection of things that we're regarding as an institution for this conversation, you have a little bit more entree. You can walk in and say, oh, this eagle on my ring, which I don't have, allows me a little bit more conversation. Now, are you going to jump to the most theoretical edge, as I am now, and say, oh, well, the autopoietic form of this collection of eagles is pushing me out, but it's allowing my ring in, which my ring being adorned on my body means that I also get entrance into this space? No. Chances are people are going to walk in and say, oh my God, I got an eagle. Look, my eagle. I can fit in this museum. Now, and that's just kind of the more casual, reflexive nature of being involved in the arts, as what I hope was evidenced by your exploring of one art world, that one art world being New York City during the hellacious and boisterous time that is Fair Week. So that's one notion, part A. Part B is this idea that 165, 166, 171 all have as verbal communication this notion that what you are looking at is not a work of art. So you walk into a museum of modern art only to be confronted with things that are not art. And this idea that this thing is not art, as Boris Groys, I think, very adeptly argues in his conversation about ready-mades, and specifically this project, is that the entirety of the exhibition becomes the work of art. The individual moment that is there is not part of the work of art. In other words, the shell becomes the work of art. Sorry, my dog just, oh, hang on. Excuse me. The problem with the home office means that my kids, meaning my pet, has the ability to interrupt me, and that's what that bark was. So don't worry, nothing happened. Wasn't even the mailman, it was just my dog barking. Anyway, so the institution or the exhibition becomes the work of art. The shell becomes the work of art. Now, I think this is a pretty cool idea, and it could just be the fact that I am a guy who likes museums. And Brothers has certainly been a kind of a touchstone for me, not only in the development of the Institute for American Art, but more broadly as someone who is engaged with the idea of how institutions function, both as a professor who deals with an arts institution as a college, but also as an artist who deals with these other institutions as just somebody who makes things, as a cultural producer, as it were. So this idea that the exhibition is the work of art is one that is relative to some of you, not relative to others of you. So the notion, for instance, to take some of your work as an example, the combination or the collection of Matt Austin's cards in the vitrine. For those of you who are not at the critiques, what happened at the midterm critique was that Matt Austin presented a field of business cards in a vitrine as a way of elevating those things up from what they normally would be, which is of a single use. I'm going to put you on my email list, and then we're done. Then we're over. Then I don't need this little piece of paper anymore, and it can go away. Well, the collection of things becomes the conveyor of the message and also the content of the message. Having one eagle doesn't make a department of eagles. Having a lot of eagles, having a lot of manifestations of eagleness becomes the installation. Now, other ways that Brothayers expanded this idea in ways that I think are just kind of quirky and fun and, well, things that I really like, was this installation, which is an exact replica of the artist's apartment, I believe is what, that's at least what Momo was saying, is that this was his apartment, and on it we have all of these conversation or words that are used to talk about works of art. And so what Brothayers is saying here is he's identifying that there is a language applied to things that make it art, and we can, if we want to, apply these things to anything. And does that subsequently make it into a work of art? Well, the fact that we have this room, the fact that this room exists and travels around as a work of art does speak to the artness of it. And I'm at 27 minutes, so I'm going to talk faster. Another project that he did that I was very keen on was he set up this crate-looking thing. It was actually a crate used to ship things, but it was decommissioned at some point. Who knows what painting was ever in it. And around that frame, as you can see around on the wall behind it, around that crate, there are images of famous works of art, postcards collected from various museum visits. And what is projecting the word fragile across that crate is a slide projector that we all know, or hopefully some of you remember from art history classes, not necessarily the ones that I teach because I'm all digital these days, but back in the day. So he's projecting the images of these works of art on this box. And essentially what he is doing here is having this conversation about what actually makes a work of art. Do I need the physical thing, or can I use this kind of a signifier to present the work of art? If I present the image of a painting, does that convey the imageness, or does it convey the fullness? What is that disconnect? And quite honestly, I just love it. Okay, Officially and Vice. I'm going to play a clip of this video as we leave, or as I end the lecture, so I'll come back to the way things go. Okay, Officially and Vice present what happens after Marcel Brothayers, and I'm going to go over 30 minutes, but I'll try and not go over by too much. So after Marcel Brothayers, and after someone like Robert Smithson codifies this with in the terminology of cultural confinement, we have the ability, really it comes from the ready-made, as was explained through Boris Groys. And I don't know about you, but when he's talking about Jesus Christ being a ready-made, I was laughing it up. Because he makes a really, really good argument as to why that is the case. And if you haven't gotten there in the text, it's not that far into the text, so you really should have gotten there by that point, because actually we're supposed to be talking about the next book now. So we are behind. I am behind. I apologize. It's not your fault that I'm behind, but it is your fault if you have not read these books. I'm going to be asking you about these books, by the way, in the future, next summer. Anyway. So what the ready-made did is it identified that the art exhibition was the thing that validated things as art. And so you have Duchamp taking a urinal into an exhibition and saying, boom, I didn't choose this. This guy Armut chose this. And actually we know it was a female artist. But if you didn't read that Hyperallergic thing, you should start reading Hyperallergic, because the editor of Hyperallergic's coming and visiting with us this summer. Okay, so you have this idea that the exhibition, right, makes the work of art. Duchamp presents us with this, and all of a sudden we have this urinal that is different through difference, or it becomes elevated because it is no longer like all the other urinals that me and all of the male identified people who can stand up and urinate utilize. It's different than that because it's inside of an art exhibition. Certainly it's signed, certainly it's on its side, but more than that, it doesn't even need to be signed, it doesn't even need to be on its side. It can really just be in the museum space. And the museum space elevates it, validates it. And this is what both Smithson and Groys identify. It's not that the curatorial has the force, which was a question that all of you very adequately answered, I gotta say. It's that the exhibition has the force, and the curator acknowledges that and kind of as a third party negotiates how that is to be used at certain times. But that is to say, I'm like talking all around the fact that we have these three elements in front of us in this image, all of which seem very familiar, I'm sure, to us, but none of which are actually representations of the same thing that you might think that they are. This is a work by Fischerly and Weiss, which is, as I said, a collaborative duo that's been making objects that are derivations on the ready-made since the 1970s. Some of their earlier work, late 1970s, they were producing pretty heavily through the 80s and into the late 90s. And it was in the late 90s that they landed on a material choice that rendered them with the most open agenda, that being molded plastic, molded polyurethane. All of these things that you are seeing, the drill, the tire, the 2x4 in the back, are all rendered in this moldable plastic. So, okay. The exhibition makes the thing. The shell creates the confines in which the living organism can develop. The exhibition does the exact same thing. It allows the artwork to develop. It gives the artwork the ability to become alive, as it were. A urinal becomes an artwork inside of the exhibition. Some associations of meat and or some meat and some things become a muscle when they're inside the safety of this shell. Now, what Groys argues, and what I really buy into, is the fact that there's this other layer that artists are beginning to examine therein. This idea that, okay, if everything that's brought into this exhibition space can be venerated as an artwork, what if we begin to problematize what those things actually are? There's always, always, always some internal loop that allows discourse to continue to generate. And I'm being pointed here when I say that it's an internal discourse. When the muscle is little, it's an internal struggle that allows it to grow bigger, to seek out bigger prey, to become more sustaining, and to ultimately develop into maturity. And so it's inside of that confine that discourse expands and that ideas get venerated. I don't know why I'm so into saying that these things have valor. They don't really have valor, but blah blah blah. I'm over time, so I'm got to keep talking fast. And I know you're probably all laughing at me as I'm like racing through these ideas fairly quickly. The good thing about videos, when they're not deleted by these stupid programs you have to use to record them, you can play them back. So just keep that loop going. Anyway, so you have artists that have been exploring the ready-made since 1917, thanks Marcel Duchamp. And it's only when you get up to these folks, Fischerly and Weiss, that you have artists that say, no, 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 there is inside of this exhibition space, inside of this cultural confinement of a museum, inside this muscle shell of cultural production, there is actually space to expand on the conversation of the ready-made. And that is to say, I need to make something that looks like a ready-made. Molded plastic. A paint bucket that you would purchase at a hardware store is also going to be made of polyurethane. I want to deliberately leave this open because this show, the Officially Advice show at the Guggenheim, was so funny because of these little moments of irreverence. These little moments when the artists decide, I kind of just want to keep going with this joke. We're inside this little muscle shell. We've got Duchamp's urinal, but we keep having audience members come into this little muscle shell, see this urinal, and say, I don't get it. And the ability that gives artists, that there are still people that refuse to kind of acknowledge things like the ready-made or the humor therein, that allow for these discourses to continue to open up. It's not always necessarily the politics of resistance that set this up. That you can kind of erase that from your memory. Instead, what's important to understand is that it is the internal politics of cultural confinement that allow for the kind of friction needed to develop and push culture forward. And that's something that Groys taps on very early in his text. It's actually in the introduction of his text, where he talks about antagonism as being the thing that is needed for artwork to continue to be produced. You need artists in even the 13th century to say, I can render that landscape a little bit better for the purposes of telling my religious story. And so I'm going to antagonize the makers before me and say, I can do it better and go. And therefore, within that little muscle shell that was, Christian religious painting in the 13th century, there was this internal dialogue, this internal discourse that wanted to continually kind of push or march towards something better, whatever that better is. And so that's kind of where we're at. We're at this moment where, in thinking about this book, this trip, these artworks, this conversation as being relative to a conversation or an analysis of an art market, think about how you answer that questionnaire, what is your art market? Because your art market is essentially your muscle shell. You are inside of a cultural confinement. It's one that you, I think, happily exist within, even though it might appear to be frustrating. Even though you might get to your studio and bang your head against a wall because you constantly feel like everything has been done inside of this little muscle shell. But what Groys points out, what Smithson points out, what the work Officially Advice and Brothers points out is that there is a benefit to that internal struggle, that internal pursuit. And so as you're going back, and as it's going to be a continuing process of unpacking what happened in New York City, but as you do that, think about that relationship. For me, my autopoietic shell does exist, I think actually too much in New York City. I need to expand it and go a little bit more into farther reaches of our domestic landscape or of just the land on Earth, if we're going to talk about a borderless world. If only we can hope, right? And so essentially, Well, that's it. I already said it. So we're all in our little muscle shells, and it's up to us to figure out how actually to problematize and move things forward. Now, for me, as somebody who studies museums, as an artist who engages with museums, um, these conversations help me define what my internal discourse is. And as you move, especially towards the thesis document, these are things to think about. What internal discourses are you responding to? Do you want to push forward? Are you frustrated by? And as you identify those discourses, think also to their manifestations in the real world. Oh my goodness, that was disgusting. Oof, I'm sorry, humans. Not for it didn't it wasn't olfactory in any sense. It was just a very guttural sound, and I apologize because that's inappropriate. But I'm wiggling around on this chair because I am so excited and over caffeinated. That's way too much information. Sorry. So there are discourses that you're responding to, and at the same time, there are physical structures that you are responding to. Those structures are your art world, and you can define them however you want. If you want to be an artist who produces books, your art world is going to exist within artist book shops. If you're an artist who wants to produce performances, you're going to be defined by the art world that presents performance projects, so on and so forth. These are your muscle shells that you can expand within as a way to problematize and like push those bubble boundaries a little bit more. Okay, so I'm going to go back up here. We're going to go to, actually, I'm going to rearrange this and I'm going to show you and that's that. So that is a video called "The Way Things Go." That's a clip. It's a 30-minute long video, and I actually Gail was mentioning that she brought this up to Sarah, right? I think maybe not Sarah, maybe Matt. I don't know. Anyway, um, thank you all, and expect another potentially, hopefully, probably not in reality, shorter lecture to follow in time.